Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills, and today we have Guillermo del Toro's 2006 Pan's Labyrinth. Now the first part of this review is going to be spoiler free. There's going to be a point where you're going to be able to click on this, and it's going to go into spoilers, but you're going to be able to skip it to the end where I just have my final conclusive points on the film, so don't worry about that if you haven't seen this. Regardless, this is probably del Toro's most critically acclaimed film. It famously had about 22 minutes worth of standing ovation at Cannes, which is kind of crazy because that's one of the longest standing ovations in Cannes history. And obviously Cannes is a very, very prestigious festival, so that's quite impressive for this film. Now, I've generally enjoyed del Toro's films, but I've never really gone out of my way to see them. I think he's got a really interesting and very distinct visual style. It's very gothic and bright and colorful and elaborate, I suppose. And I think he kind of holds the title as making the best proto-superhero films with things like Blade 2, the Hellboy films, particularly Hellboy 2, which is it's just a really solid action film. I love this aspect where you take this kind of comic book source material and then you really elevate it visually into film. I see so many, to go on a very, very small rant here, so many Marvel and DC or whatever films, besides the Zack Snyder films, they've got an actual visual touch to them, even if I'm not a big fan of it, but at least he's trying. But so many of them are just shot so blandly, so I really give him credit for kind of actually putting in effort to make these action films that actually have people that care behind them. Even something like Pacific Rim, which I wasn't huge for. It's okay. It's decent. It's just a copy of Neon Genesis Evangelion, but whatever. Gotta make money somehow. Regardless, I love that he takes that really, really distinct visual style, that reliance on practical effects, lots of costuming, lots of makeup, and he really brings it into this film, an artistic film, and he really, really makes it shine. Now, of course, he'd done this before with Kronos and The Devil's Backbone, but this was really his huge, critical foreign success, especially for an art film that he'd done. Just generally, I just adore the look of this entire film. The lighting in particular is so beautiful, and I feel like I'm going to really overuse the term gothic, but it just has that kind of grim fairy tale kind of vibe to the entire film, but in particular the lighting, these kind of streams of light coming in from everywhere. And I'm actually not sure how he achieved that effect, but it just seems to kind of ooze this vibe from it, and it fits so well into the actual setting of the world. One of my main issues with some fantasy films, and I think the only one I can think of is maybe Narnia or something, where you go from this outside world that looks like it's shot really blandly, and then you go into this fantasy world where it's shot really blandly, but then you have the opposite of that where it's really jarring, where you have the outside world is really bland and then the interior fantasy world is amazing and it's colorful and it's wacky and crazy, and it feels like they don't take place within the same universe, if you know what I mean. But here, this kind of gothic visual style is everywhere, so when you kind of transition into the actual fantastical elements, with the fawn, with the hand-eye person or whatever, it really, really smoothly comes across, and it feels so believable. It's okay, I can imagine these fantastical elements existing within this world he's created. And I'd say that's the same for Hellboy. I mean, obviously the film has a giant, red Ron Perlman running around with a fish dude, and, it feels believable because it's set up really well visually in particular. And on that point, it's pretty hard to make just basic household dialogue scenes look amazing and fit a visual style that you can go, yeah, that's gothic, that's fantastic, I can see that working in this world, where you can just shoot a bedroom scene and you put so much care into the decorations, into the clothing, into the sets, because of course this film takes place during the Spanish Civil War, and so as a period film he's kind of tweaked a lot of the outfits, I think, and a lot of the interiors and settings to just kind of enhance them for this effect. And as I was mentioning earlier, I love the use of practical effect in film. It's not always good. In fact, often during the 70s with all these schlock monster films, it's hilarious seeing people using terrible practical effects or trying to hide them with shadows with monsters and whatever. But generally I think it's a pretty heavily accepted filmic thing that practical effects are better than CGI generally, or at least practical effect enhanced with CGI like Lord of the Rings did, which obviously did it amazingly. But I've always loved del Toro's use of practical effects, particularly animatronics or monster costume design. Honestly, between Hellboy and this film, it's mind-boggling the artistry that goes into these costumes that are so complex. It's really hard, I think, when you're at that level of technicality with the costumes. I'm talking specifically the monster design in this film. One of the main characters or central characters is a fawn, and it's all practical, and just the effects of it just mind-boggling. But the main thing for me is that it isn't sticking out as just some like very, very well-crafted robot, but it actually stylistically fits with the world while also being very, very, very well made, which is kind of like, it's very, very difficult to do that, to kind of gel all these different artistic ventures together, like the clothing, like the setting. It just shows he just has like a very strong vision and really knows how to get that while being practical. And I don't mean practical in like the practical effect sense, but practical like, I need to shoot a film, I need to get this on budget, I need to be able to get these people to do this, I need my actors to be able to operate in this costume, because monster costumes, animatronics, whatever, are infamously A, uncomfortable, and B, difficult to use and awkward and rubbery and whatever. So I really got to give him like a huge kudos for being able to shoot a film where all these really, really complex elements actually fit thematically, stylistically, whatever. It's pretty amazing. Also got to commend this film's script generally. It's pretty solid. I will reiterate a point that I made in another review of the Hungarian animated film Fehelofia, that I'm really not a big fan of the mythological like 3 trials plot. If you don't know what that is, it's like a very early even Homeric literary technique where it's like the hero must complete 3 separate trials and then they win something, or they get the bounty, they get whatever, you know. And it just happens that in films and storytelling, things coming in 3s is a very, very common thing because, I don't know, it just works. It isn't 1, 1's too few, 2 is still not enough, 3 is just like the perfect amount. It fits with separate arcs. It just encapsulates nicely 3. But I generally find the 3 trials as a complete plot element pretty boring, very, very simplistic. You look at Fehelofia, that whole film is basically just spend time going to location, 3 trials that are all very similar, finish. And it's like, okay, regardless, that film is amazing and I love it and I would highly recommend it, but that plot in itself is the entirety of the film I find really, really grating. But I really got to give Pan's Labyrinth kudos here because it doesn't just spend its time completely focusing on this. It actually weaves it very, very well into the story by incorporating other subplots and kind of dilutes it through the rest of the film, so you're not constantly like, okay, she's doing this trial, now she's finished it, now she's doing this other trial. Cuts back to, you know, this captain character, and then it's cutting to these rebels, and it's cutting around, and you're like, okay, this works and it's tied pretty well into the plot. It's affected by other things. It isn't literally just character must overcome this, must overcome this, must overcome this, because that's boring as fuck. Also, still on the point of script, some really, really great foreshadowing here. I'm not giving away anything here, but there's some very, very mild visual storytelling here that, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of set design, in terms of costuming, is extremely well set up and very, very well thought out, visually intense and well planned out. Like every single shot flows very nicely into the next one. On that point, there's a kind of irritating use of like in-universe wipes. I'm not really sure what you call these, but it's just this.
Se protegían los unos a los otros. Y dormían juntos bajo la sombra de un frondoso árbol.
But the issue is that that's like a cool effect, and it kind of makes it so that every shot flows into the next one very directly. I mean, you're literally cutting within the same shot there, which is like a pretty interesting technique. But it is used so many times. Even in that one like forest walking section, it's used like 5 or 6 times, and then it's used constantly after that, constantly, and then just throughout the film. And while it is cool at first and it's kind of interesting to look at, and it kind of sets you into this almost like meditative like trance. Normally when films cut from shot to shot to shot, you have to adjust. You're going, okay, where am I? I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But when it kind of transitions like that, you're not readjusting because it's like so smoothly integrated. But I don't think you can really just use that as a technique constantly, or really any technique that you overuse. It becomes boring, becomes repetitive, it becomes irritating to look at. And I did find it a little bit irritating, especially towards the end of the film, where I was like, okay, I get it, your transitioning is clever, just stop. That's not to detract from how well the film is planned out visually as a whole. For example, this shot here, I am just in love with. It's brilliant. Just watch this.
Estuvimos solas tanto tiempo. Yo estoy contigo. No estabas sola. Nunca has estado sola. Algún día entenderás que para mí tampoco ha sido fácil. Tus manos están un poco inquieto. Anda, cuéntale uno de tus cuentos. Seguro que se calma al oír tú. Hace muchos, muchos años, En un país muy lejano y triste existió una enorme montaña de piedra negra y áspera. Al caer la tarde, en la cima de esa montaña florecía todas las noches una rosa que otorgaba la inmortalidad. Sin embargo, nadie se atrevía a acercarse a ella, pues sus numerosas espinas estaban envenenadas. Entre los hombres solo se hablaba del miedo a la muerte y al dolor, pero nunca de la promesa de la inmortalidad. Y todas las tardes, la rosa se marchitaba sin poder otorgar.
But that's not to say that every single technical effect in the film is wonderful, because I actually found the sound mixing and sound design in this film to be like really, really subpar. Particularly with sounds either being like too loud or too quiet, which is generally a sound mixing issue where you haven't like balanced everything out, but you just kind of hear sounds from a distance that sound way too close, or they're much closer visually but they sound really far away, and just kind of sound mixing all over the place. Second of all, some sound effects that like don't really match what's happening visually, and these were kind of few and subtle, but they were like a little bit jarring where you kind of go, that doesn't make that sound effect. That's weird. And there's other things where the editing kind of cuts around the sound design a bit. And I think it's most notable in this shot right at the beginning of the film where Ophelia is like putting this stone into this eyeball thing, and just listen to it. The sound just kind of cuts out awkwardly when it should have been continuous across the two shots, and there are a lot of like very, very minor examples of that, but none that really kind of stick out as like huge glaring issues. On top of just like a few kind of bigger ones like that one where it's a bit more obvious and kind of jarring, it's just a few little things as a whole that just kind of undermine the general quality of the sound design. And this complaint kind of comes from someone who does a fair amount of editing and knows stock sound effects, but there's a lot of stock sound effects in this, and not only that, but they're reused a lot in the film. And really that only annoys me because I've heard them before and I just kind of like laugh it off, but it definitely does kind of take you out of the film a bit. And even if you haven't heard them, you'd kind of be like, wait, why have I heard the exact same bird calling sound, 4 times throughout the film, or the same horse sound 3 times throughout the film, or something like that? And all these points, particularly about sound design, are pretty minor, but they kind of do add up to the point where it is kind of like pretty subpar, especially compared to how great every other technical element in the film is. Also, I just want to mention that I know that this is dependent on the era, but some of the CGI here is pretty lackluster. I understand that obviously there are some things you just cannot do with practical effects, but I feel like they probably could have worked a little bit more with like miniatures in some sets, and particularly with this character, this Toad character. I was getting some like special edition Star Wars Jabba the Hutt vibes from him. Movements are really blocky, and you can kind of tell that Ophelia, the main character, isn't really there with him, and it's like, this doesn't really work, and it kind of takes you out from how great something like the Fawn's design is, with a practical costume. But I understand totally that he wanted to make a film, and the CGI just wasn't at that level yet. He'd have to give it another like 5 years, and it would have looked fine, but at this point it's still in that like really shaky era. But I will say that for a child actor, she actually does do a really good job dealing with and acting around like non-existent CGI entities. I've always considered, especially from seeing like behind the scenes stuff with The Hobbit, just how hard it is to act against nothing and get responses from nothing, and nothing is real around you, and it's like, that just must be so hard for an actor, and then on top of that, a child actor as well. So I gotta really give her kudos. I'm not an enormous fan of her performance. It's solid, but it's not like mind-boggling at all. But I really gotta give her kudos for actually being able to get past that and kind of achieve like a pretty good standard. And this might be me, or it might just be like the color tone or the color grading, or I don't know, the style it was going for. But I feel like some daytime shots are just colored to look like nighttime shots, and it's really weird because that's like a terrible like student film thing to do, of like, oh shit, we accidentally shot this daytime scene at nighttime, or shot this nighttime scene at daytime. What do we do? I know, we'll just fix it in post. It's all good to just color it blue. But I guess they thought they like couldn't do it outside at nighttime or something. It was easier to shoot the daytime, but the lighting is so bright, but it's so like intensely blue. I just it looks like daytime to me, but I could be completely wrong on that though. But anyway, they're my main grievances on a technical level, and don't take the amount of time it took me to explain them as an actual relativity to the technical prowess of the film. It just happens to be that the small technical issues that the film does have do take a little while to get through, and as a whole they're like a very, very, very minor complaint against this like amazing film technically. In terms of acting, as I said before, I'm like okay with Ophelia's performance, this girl's performance, and everyone else is decent except this Captain Vidal character who just blows everyone else out of the water by far, especially with his character as well. I gotta say, first of all, I have like a slight bias for like sympathetic antagonists. I just really like it. Conceptually, I like the kind of good-evil dynamic to be way more wishy-washy than it normally is in films, because when you kind of cement characters as I am morally good, I am morally wrong, or whatever, it just is so static in those two positions, and then when you kind of divulge it into good character does horrible things sometimes, and horrible character does good things sometimes, or horrible character is very, very dedicated, he's kind of noble for a cause or whatever, like Captain Vidal is, like this character is. And I just love it. It's not to say that like every single morally ambiguous villain or whatever is good, it just happens to be that the ones that are well written just tower above, you know, just straight up like, I am evil for no reason. Like, I think I've found that most people on Earth are not inherently like evil people. Like, sure, they exist, of course, but I just don't think many people naturally, and you're basing your characters off people, you know, to make them more human. Most people aren't just like complete dickheads just as a whole. They have a reason for it. There's some sort of warped like internal mechanism in their brain that makes them act in a certain way. And that's really where the ambiguity comes in. That's really where good writing comes in, is when you're able to kind of dissect the reasoning for a character to act like a complete dick. And when I say sympathetic main villain, I mean this guy is like a megalomaniac, like sociopath who tortures people and really kind of like gets off to it. But his entire backstory really makes sense, and it's really understandable, and he's a noble, you know, good commander. He's a strong leader. He's a strong person. I just love that contrast. But on top of that, the acting for him is just wonderful. He just has such a strong screen presence, but he's so kind of gentle and in control. He isn't this kind of like mustache twirling villain. He's really just a kind of commander-in-chief type. And on top of that, he's not an idiot either. He actually openly admits at one point in the film that his like main sin is pride, or his downfall is pride and kind of overestimating his own abilities. But you know, he's even able to like identify his own issues, which is fantastic. It's great, really, really good character writing, and then really, really good character acting as well. So I really got to give kudos specifically A, to that character, and B, to the actor playing him. Now, on a bit of a side note, this film is kind of known to be a spiritual successor to Del Toro's earlier film, The Devil's Backbone, which is very, very similar, not so much visually, though there are some similarities there. It deals with a very similar setting. It's with the Spanish Civil War. It deals with kind of children, deals with themes of maturity, of growing up, having to deal with oncoming threats in a very, very intense environment. It kind of plays the Spanish Civil War off into this kind of like smaller dramatic character piece, and kind of parallels that slightly. But I gotta say that I wasn't wowed by The Devil's Backbone. I feel like it's definitely an inferior prototype for Pan's Labyrinth. Pan's Labyrinth, not only in the script, not only in characters, but on a technical and visual level, it is far superior to The Devil's Backbone. But it's very interesting to kind of see that film, and I'd recommend seeing it simply if you like Pan's Labyrinth, because you're going to be able to kind of see this very, very early stage design of things that would eventually go into Pan's Labyrinth, but in a story that's markedly different. It doesn't really have the like gothic fantastical elements, but it definitely has play on the Pan's Labyrinth idea. Okay, so I'm going to go into spoilers now. If you want to avoid those, click here. It'll take you past the spoilers to my conclusive points on the film, and yeah. I feel like the subtext of maturity here, which is a main kind of theme in the film, you know, Ophelia learning to grow up and kind of get rid of her fantastical kind of delusions, because her mother, and I guess a few other people around her, kind of think that her reading these fairy tales is actually deluding her, which it may or may not be, of course, which is kind of the whole end of this film, is you're not really sure if she actually dies for real, or it's just a fantasy, it's just a dream that she's in. Also on that point, I thought they'd kind of play with that a bit more and make it a bit more ambiguous, but it does seem like it really sticks for the fantasy is actually real ending, and there isn't really like an overt point to show, hey, this actual fantasy landscape might not be real. But anyway, I feel like a lot of the maturity messages in this film are very, very explicit. I think in terms of the plot, you already get this idea that, hey, the film's about like this girl having to deal with the full force of like, you know, growing up in this like horrible environment with this kind of terrible father figure, and having to deal with that as a kind of like like forced maturity thing. But then you just have characters coming along being like, Ophelia, fantasy isn't real, you gotta grow up, you gotta be more mature, and it's like really on the nose. And I kind of felt like that was the same with The Devil's Backbone as well. It was very in your face about it in terms of like characters literally telling the main character like, you gotta grow up, you gotta do this, you gotta do this, over and over and over again. And it gets to the point where they're kind of hammering it in so hard, they're just beating you to death with it, you know? Also, I just randomly kind of went on a tangent back there before about the ending being more ambiguous or less ambiguous than I actually thought it would be. But I think it's interesting to note that although I kind of did see the double fake out where it's kind of heavily implied that the Fawn character is actually more malicious than he appears to be, and then it's actually a fake out where he's actually good and he's simply testing Ophelia's like morality. Although I did see that coming, I don't think that's to like the test of the script, because it writes it very, very subtly and kind of as well as you can possibly write that for that type of plot twist, for that type of narrative. So even though it was still a little bit obvious and I kind of was expecting like that double fake out, I still got to give it kudos that it did handle that very, very well. But regardless, those little visual references like the Fawn's head at the bedpost or on the maze are just really nice little like references to that character before he even pops up in the film, which is like so well visually planned out. Mint. Anyway, I guess as a whole, this film is about, you know, self-sacrifice and maturity, which of course is paralleled against the Spanish Civil War, where the guerrillas are kind of fighting against fascism for a noble cause, even though they're against huge, fierce opposition, and sacrificing yourself for ideals, which of course is what Ophelia does in the end, where she says, no, I'm not going to bow down and like murder my brother, you know, I'm not going to kill an innocent person, I'm going to stick to my ideals. Of course, she is indirectly killed for that. Of course, that's kind of her final pass into heaven or the afterlife or the fantasy realm, whatever. But on that point, as I was mentioning earlier, even Captain Vidal kind of follows that theme of like the self-sacrifice, the nobleness. All he wants towards the end of the film is to make sure his son kind of knows who he is, knows his story, knows his heritage, and then he's denied that horribly because I guess he's not a particularly nice person. But that's kind of where the sympathetic element comes in, is that all he was really doing was his job and he was doing it to the best of his ability, and then he's just murdered for that, which is pretty sad. Apparently as a whole, this film reflects this Kierkegaard quote that Del Toro really likes, which is, and as he paraphrases, the tyrant's reign ends with his death, but the martyr's reign starts with his death. I think that is the essence of the movie. It's about living forever by choosing how you die, which, yeah, is kind of following that theme of like self-sacrifice, of martyrdom. And yeah, I think that theme is tied pretty well into the film. It's not extremely overt. Characters don't directly talk to Ophelia like, hey, you have to self-sacrifice, you gotta do this, you gotta do this. It's all about the maturity, which I think is overt, but that kind of self-sacrifice, that nobleness theme, yeah, handled pretty well. Anyway, this film is easily my favorite Del Toro film. It's really, really wonderfully made, and I also got to really give him credit for sticking to his artistic ideals. He actually subtitled this entire film himself personally because he didn't like the English subtitling for The Devil's Backbone, and also he took about half the budget he could have gotten simply so the film could be spoken in Spanish. So he really, really, like I was saying, struck strongly to an idea, a visual idea, and his idea of the film, and basically took no shit from anyone to get it made. I really, really got to commend him for that, because not only did he make a fantastic film, he made a fantastic film under those circumstances. So you did a good job, Del Toro. Feeling an 84 out of 100 on this one. If you want to see other reviews, check them out down here. I mentioned Fehalofia, which is also kind of not particularly similar. It's very, very psychedelic, animated, also mythological, I guess, kind of film, but that's the closest I can kind of think of in terms of actual film reviews. If you want to check out another video essay I did one from Bela Tarr and his influences from neorealism, so check that out if you want. And yeah, farewell.